Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for dialing in and for making time this morning to spend our morning with Clem. Just a couple of logistical issues very quickly. We are starting a little bit late, but we still have time to spare. Just to say that there are a large number of people that have dialed in this morning, so thank you very much for your time. The logistics around this morning will be that Clem will spend 40 minutes talking to us, and then for 20 minutes of our session, we will have questions. You will see on your capability that there is a chat box. So please, as the morning unfolds, please type your questions through. We won't be having an open mic purely because of the numbers of people that have joined us this morning. And I will then, at the end of our session, do the QA and facilitate the questions that I've received from you with Clem. What are we going to cover this morning? Well, Clem will be going through the history of scenario planning. We thought it really appropriate that we part some skills around, where does scenario planning stem from? And also, Clem will show why it is such an essential methodology in these uncertain times. Clem will also update us on the flags, looking at the changing of the global game prior to the pandemic and then post the pandemic. He released his article not too long ago. And so just to update us on the developments post-pandemic, or shall I say during the pandemic and then post-pandemic, and then the implications for South Africa. So Clem, UMSA really appreciates your ongoing support. I mean, not just for the Institute, but also for our profession. And we are really looking forward to spending this morning with you. And therefore, with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much, Clem.
Thanks, Chris. And what a pleasure speaking for UMSA, because as I observed to you a few moments ago, risk management probably is one of the absolutely necessary management skills for any business as we come out of this pandemic, because you've got to balance so many things against one another. And that's what risk management is all about. The history of scenario planning really started in 1960 with a book by a guy called Herman Kahn. And he was an employee of the RAND Corporation, which did research and analysis for the US Armed Forces in the 50s and 60s. And his book was called On Thermonuclear War, Thinking the Unthinkable. And at the time it was unthinkable. But if you remember, in the 60s, America and Russia came very close to nuclear war over the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was a lot of misunderstanding between the two sides. So Herman's scenario nearly became reality. But he became quite famous because of the popularity of the book. He founded the Hudson Institute to teach scenario planning. And one of his students was Pierre Wack, W-A-C-K. He was a Frenchman. He was the top student at l'École Polytechnique in Paris, so he was a very smart guy, and he wanted to be a futurist. So he studied under Herman and then became head of scenario planning at Royal Dutch Shell during the 1970s. And he, in fact, captured both oil price shocks in scenarios. The first one was in the early 70s when the oil price went from $8 to $12 a barrel. And the second was when it went from $12 to $32 a barrel in the late 70s. And that second scenario, Shell decided to act on and stocked a huge amount of oil ahead of the actual shock itself, made a lot of money. And Pierre became a legend in London and came to our attention in Anglo American. We were the largest mining company in the world at the time. And our Belgian economist in London said, why don't we use this methodology for what we produce, such as diamonds and gold and copper and other things? Because all our forecasts during the 1970s had proved to be totally, woefully wrong, and we needed another tool to look at the future. So we asked Pierre to come out to Johannesburg to talk to our executive, which he did. I was secretary of the executive committee at the time, and he gave a fantastic lecture. But what bowled everybody in the room over was, before he started, he said, "Can I light up?" And we all thought he was going to light a Gauloise cigarette, being French. Instead of which, he produced 2 incense sticks, stuck them under his nostrils, and said, "I think more clearly about the future when I'm smelling incense." I don't think after that we've ever had incense again in the Anglo executive room, but it sure went down well with his audience, and we hired him on the spot to be our consultant, because we knew he was going to retire from Shell. And Gavin Reddy, who was the chairman at the time, looked around the room. His eyes are lighted on me as secretary and said, "Why don't you look after this discipline inside the company along with your mining responsibilities?" And I had this incredible privilege of working with probably the top scenario planner in the world for about 10 years before he retired in the 90s as a consultant to us. And he did the job. We did global scenarios for the 1990s back in 84, 85, and we did scenarios for South Africa. We had a South African team, a team in London, and we had Pierre and his circle of remarkable men. And it was an amazing exercise, because in the global scenarios, we had one which was called Imperial Twilight, which was where the Soviet Union disappeared at the end of the 1980s because of the arms race bankrupting it. And yeah, it did disappear. We hadn't known about Mikhail Gorbachev at the time, and it's that's what you do with scenarios. You don't necessarily get the actual cause, but you get the possibility of something happening because of all the forces that are driving that thing to happen, which was the Soviet Union not having enough money to continue the arms race. It was a very critical scenario for South Africa, because there were lots of people in government who were still very much in the mode of Reds under your beds, and that South Africa couldn't become a vassal state of the Soviet Union. And I'm not sure that the negotiations would have ever happened if the Soviet Union hadn't disappeared. So it was a crucial precondition for what happened in South Africa. As far as the South African scenarios were concerned, we produced 2: the high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement, and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland. And in the mid-80s, I was deputized to go out and give public presentations, which I did. And quite a few members of the audience said to me, "How can Anglo send a highly paid manager like you around the country preaching a fairy tale? Because there is absolutely no way the National Party will ever sit down with the ANC and negotiate a settlement." And of course it happened, and it happened sooner than we thought. It happened, in the early 90s, whereas we were thinking that people would come to their senses in the mid-90s. So it really emphasized that title of Herman Kahn's, subtitle of Herman Kahn's book, Thinking the Unthinkable. I had the privilege of going to see Nelson Mandela in prison about a month before he was released, because he wanted to hear the scenarios, and I had 5 hours with the great man. And he was very tuned in to the high road scenario and the need for reconciliation between everybody in South Africa so that we could get back into the global economy. So it achieved its job, that exercise, because it changed the conversation from a very miserable one that we were going to have a civil war to one that said, if we behave sensibly, we can actually get back into the global economy, and all sanctions will be dropped. After the end of that exercise, the actual methodology fell away inside Anglo American. And it was only in the year 2000 that I thought of a way of reviving it when I read a thesis by a young woman called Chantell Ilbury, who was doing her executive MBA at the UCT Graduate School of Business. And her thesis was on how scenario planning could be made more practical for small business to use in looking at potential markets. And it was such a good document. I said to her, why don't we collaborate on a book? And it took us 5 months to write it, and we published it in June 2001. And we called it The Mind of a Fox. And we used a metaphor from a Greek poet called Archilochus, who in 650 BC wrote the following line: the hedgehog knows one big thing, whereas the fox knows many little things. Why he chose those two animals, heaven only knows. But it was a very nice way of contrasting somebody who forecasts the future and then bets everything on that single forecast with our approach, which was to consider multiple scenarios of the future, look at the flags that were attached to the different scenarios, and based on whether the flags were up or down, change the probabilities of the scenario as the future evolved. So it's a dynamic process. It never stops. It's not something that you do and then just sit back. And interestingly, an American futurist called Philip Tetlock, he's well known in America, about 2 years after we published the book, did an analysis of 28,000 expert forecasts that Americans had made over the previous 25 years. And he used our analogy of the fox and the hedgehog, and he said foxes were much better at capturing the future than hedgehogs. So we were very pleased to have that kind of support. We basically said inside the book that not only do you have to look at the scenarios, consider the flags, you've got to decide what your best options are to meet the challenges offered by the scenarios, and then you've got to make decisions. So you've got to go through the whole process. And obviously you've got to adapt. You know, if the scenario probabilities change, then you've got to adapt your decisions. So that's why we call it the mind of a fox, because foxes are very adaptable animals and they're very agile when it comes to escaping threats and obviously grabbing opportunities. One of the things we did in the book was a letter to George Bush, in which we said that part of his legacy would be determined by whether he was a fox when he was president of the United States. And we said his biggest risk at the time was a massive terrorist strike on a Western city. And in fact, it was the only book published in the world in 2001 that actually captured the idea of a major attack on a Western city. Why do I know that? Because somebody from the US State Department rang me up 3 months after the book was published and said, you know, we've been looking around the world at literature and yours is the only book that had the idea of a 9/11 attack in it. How come? So I said, well, we're South Africans and we had no idea that it was going to happen in New York, that it was going to happen with planes and all that kind of stuff. But we had 3 flags which suggested that the probability of such an attack was rising. Number 1 was the growing confrontation between the major religions of the world, which began in the late 80s and intensified during the 1990s. The second flag was the growing sophistication of terrorist movements around the world during the 1990s. But the flag which convinced us that something might be in the offing was the 2 attacks by Al-Qaeda on American embassies in Africa, one in Tanzania and the other in Kenya in 1998. And so it happened, and overnight we became quite popular in America. And since then we've been doing work with American companies, South African companies, European companies, Australian companies. And it's been a really interesting space to be in. Probably one of the most memorable sessions I did was in 2006 when the Chinese Communist Party asked me to go and show them how scenario planning worked. They have a place called the Central Party School, which is just outside Beijing, which is the leadership academy for the party. And that school develops their 5-year plans. And they wanted to know how they could road test their 5-year plans against different global economic scenarios, and they asked me to go and show them the methodology. And it was a fascinating day for me because not only did I do that, but they wanted to do a scenario because they were quite fearful of an American recession. They said that they had $1.5 trillion worth of American debt, and they didn't want that debt to go bad. And so we actually wrote a scenario. It wasn't a crash scenario, it was a recession scenario. And the flag we chose to indicate whether the probability of that scenario was rising was property values in America. Because we reckon that if property values decline, that would reduce consumer expenditure, which was 2/3 of the American economy, and that would then lead into a recession. And interestingly, we kept in touch after we'd done this session, and in the last quarter of 2006, property values leveled out in America, and in the first quarter of 2007, they fell for the first 3 months. And then they fell for the next 3 months. So by June 2007, we were giving an 80% probability to a recession in America. And then, of course, the stock market started declining in September 2007. So we jumped it to virtually 100%. And of course, that's what happened in 2008. So it was a brilliant example of, how the kind of flag and scenario system worked. I don't know what they actually did. They never told me whether they boosted the internal economy to make up for loss of exports to America, but obviously they were ahead of the game. So what are the flags now that companies are talking about that we do work for? And I covered them in a book which I wrote in 2015 called Flag Watching. Well, the religious flag is still around, and it's being forgotten about because of the pandemic. But a few weeks ago, there was an incident where Iranian gunboats came too close to American warships in the Gulf, and they were warned to stay away or they'd be shot out of the water, which showed that that flag is still very much in play. The red flag. We have 3 countries, really, and their relationships with America: Russia, China, and North Korea. Russia, at the moment, still has sanctions from Europe and America, and they still hold on to the part of the Crimea that they've annexed. And so it's a difficult situation, and Russia supplies 25% of Europe's energy needs. So obviously, when we do work with European companies, we talk about the risks involved in terms of this particular situation with Russia. The second country we talk about is China, and of course the relationship between China and America is probably one of the most important flags to watch, and particularly as we come out of this pandemic. Is it going to be any different to what it was before it began? And one of the points we make is that China will probably end up by 2035, 2040 as the biggest economy in the world. So just as the 19th century belonged to Britain and the 20th century belonged to America, ultimately the 21st century will belong to China. And that is huge because you think about it, ever since the Industrial Revolution, we've been led by Western countries. Obviously, Japan has become a very influential economy after the Second World War. But really, for China to get back to the top, because that's where they were in 1600, will be a huge event. And in many ways, I'm so glad that we belong to BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and with the apostrophe S at the end. But that's very important for us because we are part of the future, because India is not far behind China. As for North Korea, there's been rumors about whether Kim Jong-un has died or not. He hasn't been seen around. Well, he was seen at one event cutting the tape, and then somebody said it was his body double. So nobody knows about that. But obviously, it's very important because North Korea has 45 nukes, and they also have a missile system that can hit any country in the region, which includes Russia, China, South Korea, Japan. And so, it's one of those things you have to keep your eye on, because it certainly raises the risk of doing long-term business in the Far East whilst this situation is there. The third flag is probably the most important one, I've said, for investment. It's called the grey flag of the aging of the global population. And I've made it very clear that where this flag is up, which is in Europe, particularly in places like Italy and Greece, and in Japan, which is the oldest nation on earth, you're going to have very slow growing economies, if at all, because old people simply don't consume as much. And it's been like that for the last 20 years. Indeed, Pierre Wack in 1978 said, if Japan ever has a property crash, it will never grow again. And I thought that's a very specific comment from you, Pierre. But he had a Japanese wife, so I obviously kept it in mind. And in 1990, there was a property crash in Japan because of absurd values in Tokyo. And Japan basically has never grown at the rate that they did in the 70s or 80s since then. And if there's one thing I've been very consistent about since 2000 is, if you invest your money overseas from South Africa, put it in America, don't put it in Europe or the UK, because of this grey flag. The FTSE 100 on December the 31st, 1999 was 6,950. What is it this morning? 5,900. So it's 1,000 points behind where it was nearly 20 years ago. Now, no financial planner would have told you that that would have happened. Obviously, you've made money out of the dividends, but you wouldn't have made money in capital appreciation. In America, the Dow Jones at that moment, turn of the century, was 11,000. It's now 23,000. So you'd have doubled your money in America. So it's a very important flag to consider when you're investing in other countries. The next flag I talked about in the book was the anti-establishment flag, the fact that since 2008, the financial crash, we've had a global economy where the super rich have gone back to being super rich, but the middle class and working class have basically never really got back to where they were in 2007. Yes, wages and salaries have increased, but not at the rate of inflation. And so there's a growing inequity in the world, which has really come to light. In fact, Thomas Piketty, who wrote a book a few years ago called Capital in the 21st Century, said that inequity today is as bad as it was in the Edwardian era in 1914. And yes, we had the First World War, the Second World War, that evened people up because it destroyed a lot of wealth. We had the 60s and 70s, which were universal growth and prosperity. And then the inequality started creeping in. And that's led to a lot of anger in people. And so political dynamics have changed. It produced Donald Trump, even though he's a billionaire himself. He kind of made the proposition that he would be up against, he'd clean out Washington. And so he presented himself as anti-establishment. In a sense, Boris Johnson did the same with Brexit. He got the vote in the north because they were voting against the London political establishment. So it's everywhere. It's in Europe, and it's firing up populism, it's firing up nationalism, and it's going against that huge flag we had in the last century of globalization, which stressed the freedom of movement of people and goods in order not to have a third world war. And I'm afraid to say that's under great threat. We even produced a scenario in the book, The Mind of a Fox, for George Bush, which we called Gilded Cage, where we said that if the rich old millions living in America and Europe started putting bars on a cage to try and keep out the poor young billions, that would be very difficult for the world economy. We talked of the green flag because of the problems of climate change and the sixth extinction of species. And of course, that flag will still be there when we come out of the pandemic. We talked of the national debt flag because 2008 produced a whole raft of easy money measures, which added to national debt around the world. And of course, it led to very low interest rates. And those figures in 2008 have been completely overshadowed by what's happened over the last few months in terms of adding to national debt. For example, America's debt is now beyond 100% of GDP, when it really should be around about 60% of GDP. I mean, the only time America had a national debt beyond its GDP was 1942 during the Second World War. And so this is going to be a problem, no matter how the pandemic ends. But one of the last flags I mentioned in the book was the pandemic flag. I spent quite a lot of time talking about other pandemics, the Black Death in 1346, which killed 30% of the European population, the Great Plague in 1665, which killed a quarter of the London population, the Spanish flu, which was 100 years ago, between 1917 and 1920, which killed between 50 and 100 million people. And of course, we do have a pandemic today with HIV/AIDS. It's killed 39 million people, and there are 35 million people living with HIV/AIDS. And thank heavens, we've turned it into a chronic disease because of the brilliant antiretrovirals that we have now. But what I said in the book was that because of international travel, because of megacities produced by urbanization, and because viruses were jumping from animals into humans, the likelihood of a pandemic in the near future was high, and therefore it should be considered as a global risk. And indeed, I didn't obviously say 2020, but here we are. We're now in the middle of this pandemic. So I decided to write some scenarios around the pandemic. I produced an article at the beginning of March for News 24, and then I produced an article on April the 20th, just over 3 weeks ago. And these are the 4 scenarios that I posed for the pandemic. The first one was Much Ado About Nothing, which certainly at the beginning of the March was being touted by a lot of American experts, saying that this was just like ordinary flu, and it would be a seasonal thing, and it would probably disappear like SARS or MERS. And I, at the time, said that I didn't think this was a likely scenario, but nevertheless, I posted it there because, you know, there were a lot of eminent people talking about it on the cable news channels. And indeed, even now, people are saying that this is still not a serious pandemic. It's just another outbreak of flu. My point is this, that if it had just been a normal outbreak of flu, you wouldn't have seen those chaotic scenes in New York and in London, where hospitals and emergency staff were running out of emergency gear and ventilators and all kinds of things. That doesn't happen normally, but it certainly did happen during March. And it showed to me that the one thing that is going to change is the meaning of defense, because we've always thought of defense meaning nuclear weapons and troops and all that kind of stuff. And America and everybody spends so much money on that. But the preparedness for this pandemic was pathetic, absolutely pathetic. And you know, in future, I think that there's going to be a completely different attitude to public health in terms of how you are as prepared for a pandemic like this as you are prepared for a nuclear war or any other kind of war. So it has been a game-changing scenario, what's happened, and therefore I don't like the idea of calling it much ado about nothing. The second scenario I call camel's straw, because there is a straw that breaks the camel's back. It doesn't have to be a major pandemic either, because before we went into this, the world economy was fragile. We had the China American spat. We had, as I said, a huge level of national debt and easy money. We had China itself slowing down economically because of its one-child policy. It's now a middle-aged nation. It's age 2. And so the economy is slowing down. I mean, they're back to a two-child policy, but the one-child policy certainly has limited China's growth. And that's had an impact on the global economy. So we already had a delicate situation, and you don't need a big pandemic killing millions of people to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And that was the logic behind this scenario. The markets think otherwise. I mean, during March, they did go down with the initial stages of the pandemic. Then in April, they've rallied. The Wall Street and London have rallied. And this month has very much been a fluctuating month where one day the market goes up, the next day the market goes down. But there's Trump. He basically saying, you know, we're through the worst and we can now get back to business. And indeed, the infection rates, which is a key flag, the new infections every day, have flattened out. There's no doubt about it in Europe and in America. And the number of deaths has started to come down. So it would look as if they're past their peak and they're beginning to open for business again. And so the markets are feeling, you know, it's going to take maybe till September to really start opening the global economy. But by the end of the year, it could be firing on all cylinders. So that's a very strong scenario in the markets. But I would say that you cannot ignore the camel's straw scenario because we don't know whether there's going to be a second wave of infections as a result of the opening up. You only had to look at the pictures on the London tube yesterday where people were very close to each other again. There wasn't any social distancing at all because you can't distance on a tube. What interested me was that half the people weren't even wearing masks. And I would have thought that the British government would have made it mandatory to wear a mask on mass travel systems like the tube or indeed on buses and other things, but they haven't. So, you know, you cannot discount a second wave for this pandemic. In the case of Spanish flu, which, as I said, was the big disaster 100 years ago, it was the second wave that killed a lot of people. It wasn't the first wave. And so you cannot discount that second wave. And so one of the really critical flags to watch is the number of new cases over the next 2 months. Because, you know, you've got the greater freedom of movement. It takes about 2 weeks to get through to the actual figures of testing and new cases. So I think camel's straw is still very much in play. The third scenario is the worst case scenario, Spain again, that indeed this first round was fairly mild, and the virus mutates and then it kills a whole lot of people. And that's why I call it the Spain again scenario. It is a worst case scenario. It is put forward by epidemiologists, but they tend to put forward worst case scenarios. But we have to bear it in mind because that is the reason that people are pleading caution as we come out of the lockdown. It is still there, and despite the fact that you're seeing the curves flattening in Europe and America. Russia, it's got about 10,000 new cases every day. Brazil is also very high. And so we really can't, say that the Spain again scenario is simply not going to happen. It could well happen. And the last scenario really flows out of, trying to avoid both Camel's straw and Spain again, and I call it the tightrope scenario. It's where you set out on this delicate balancing act, balancing lives against livelihoods, and walking along the tightrope so that you don't fall into the Camel's straw and you don't fall into Spain again. You open up the global economy. Boris Johnson called it baby steps. In America, essentially every state is being allowed to open up at its own pace. And Australia and New Zealand are opening up, and quite a few European countries are opening up, and we in South Africa are opening up too. So we are now in, the tightrope scenario, and so far so good. You haven't had a sudden increase in new cases, and we haven't yet seen absolutely desperate figures for the global economy, which would suggest that we're in a long depression. So we may make it across the tightrope, and next year, in the middle, towards the end of next year, we will be back into what I call a new normal, not the old normal, a new normal, because we are going to have physical distancing. I think one of the last things to open up will be mass events, sporting events, because they've shown that shouting is one of the ways of dispersing the virus. So there are things that are going to probably only start up once there is a vaccine. And I have to say that there's so many things around this virus which are still uncertain. We don't know how many asymptomatic cases there are, people who've actually got the virus but show no symptoms at all. It's very mild. We certainly don't know what the mortality rate is. Experts think it's around 1%, but there are some countries at 12% of cases, and there are some at less than 1%, so nobody knows what the fatality rate is. Whether people are immune once they've had the virus and then recover is also unknown at this point in time. So, there's a lot of things we still have to learn about the virus itself, but we're looking at we're looking at this. So my final point is South Africa. I think it was absolutely right to lock down, and I think Cyril was quite correct, because we had to get the medical resources in order, and we had to get people prepared. So I was very glad he sounded like a commander-in-chief when he did the initial lockdown and then the 2-week extension. I have to say that when we opened up to level 4, there was certain confusion, as we all know, around cigarettes and other things like that. I hope with last night's speech that he's going to clarify. It seems that they're going to clarify what level 3 is, and they're going to do certain things to level 4. They seem to want to keep level 4 where there are hotspots, and everybody else will move to level 3. That kind of came out of last night's talk. So far so good in South Africa. But when we come out of the lockdown, we have to be ready for business. And you're going to have to think of balancing the risk of infection against the risks of obviously keeping in business, and particularly for employees and particularly for customers. So that's where risk management is going to come into play big time, because it applies to our families, sending kids to school. It applies to all aspects of our life. We cannot get away from it. And so I would like to end with a benediction for all of you who have been listening to me. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much. I can't hear you, unfortunately, Chris.
Clem, thank you very much. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing your insights. Thank you for this morning with Clem. I've got a whole host of questions. We are on 11, so I'm going to moderate some of these. Some have the same sort of inclination. But before I get there, please, to the audience, send your questions through, because we would love to see and hear from you. Clem, question, I think you alluded to that a little bit earlier, but has government approached you at all for your insights, for advice? And then the gentleman says, Johan, he says, and in any case, if they haven't, what was going to be your advice to them should they have asked?
Well, they haven't. And to be quite honest, I've wanted to sort of step back and write the scenarios, which I did for News 24, and just hope that people in government read them. You know, they can just access News 24. And indeed, any of you in the audience, if you want to, you just put in Google Clem Sunter, and you'll get to a copy of this article. It's called "Walking the Tightrope," and my advice would have been absolutely to go for the lockdown as a breathing space, which is what Cyril did, and indeed to open up, but to be absolutely clear what each step of opening up is, because people really want a clear message. They've actually been very compliant during the lockdown, and you know what? Everybody thought there would be social unrest, widespread social unrest, but actually the best has come out of South Africans at the kind of street level. It's been the most amazing experience, with people providing food and doing lots of other things, and all these funds, of course, that are being administered by government and also by private individuals and companies. So I would have advised exactly what the government did, but I'm now saying they've got to be very, very clear to the public as they ease each step of the lockdown.
Clem, second question from Peter is, if this was a flag in your book, why do you think that South Africa was so unprepared? And would you think this is because of bad risk management?
Yeah, the thing is that I guess as human beings, we don't appreciate some risks because they're not sort of right in front of us. We tend to be fight or flight animals, and that's why, you know, having Russians to build nuclear weapons against is such an obvious thing for Trump to do, because, you know, you can see them. A virus is invisible, and indeed, if you go back, we haven't had the kind of mass pandemic that we had in 1918 to 1920. So we haven't had an experience of a threat like this, and that's when risk management really comes into play with scenario planning. Is you've got to go through that process of imagining different possible futures to actually say this poses a risk, even though it's not on anybody's spreadsheet. It's the same applies exactly to technology and to all kinds of things. I mean, when I worked for the banking industry, nobody had an idea how much modern technology and in terms of devices would change the role of branches, but it has. And I guess it's because people don't like inconvenient truths. That's why this whole thing on climate change was called by Al Gore an inconvenient truth. They don't like it. They don't like to consider it as a risk. We love to only consider scenarios that we want to happen. And the critical thing about being a scenario planner is to look at those things that can happen, which are totally outside our normal sphere of interest, and we don't want to happen. And so that's why I mentioned it, and very few other people. I think Bill Gates mentioned it in a book, and there were apparently one or two government studies done in the US, but not here in South Africa. So yeah, I'm afraid to say it just shows what human nature is about. We don't appreciate the true risk of existence, and that's why you have to play scenarios.
Clem, thanks. Before I get to a very interesting question from Claude Hamman, just wanted to ask a question from Kathy, which now links in very much to the point that you've made, the top of mind sort of risks, the short-term view of risks. If we can't see it, we can't believe it. How would you expect the message to boards and excos to change going forward from now on, given the lessons that we've learned?
Well, it depends how much social distancing and things like that remain around, and that depends on a vaccine. And if you talk to the experts, they say a vaccine is 12 to 18 months away. So we're talking about something that would only be available, in the first half of next year, maybe the second half. There are optimists who say Oxford is working on a vaccine which will be available later this year. And there are the pessimists who say maybe this is one of those viruses for which a vaccine is never available. I mean, HIV/AIDS has not yet got a vaccine. It's got some very good treatments, but not a vaccine. So you get all kinds of answers from the experts. But obviously, one of the most important things to be saying to boards is, how on earth are we going to work once we get back to something approaching full capacity, and at the same time comply with the conditions of social distancing, both for our employees and for our customers? I mean, in America, restaurants are in a huge bind because they don't want to be sued, and so they're having to work out the exact layout of tables inside the restaurants, or whether the tables should be outside the restaurants, whether they only can allow 10 or 20 people inside the restaurant. So essentially, for the time being, the risk experts should be telling management exactly what social distancing means in terms of the business itself, and what should be done to minimize the risk, not to take it away altogether, because planes, for example, people have to get on the planes, and there has to be some risk inside the aeroplane, whatever you do. They're talking about removing the middle seat. So it all comes back to what is reasonable to reduce the risk for your particular industry.
Okay, Clem, a whole host of questions, very interesting. The World Economic Forum has highlighted this pandemic, or at least pandemic, for the last, 10 to 13 years. This is from Claude Hamman. So I'm asking this question because there are so many that came up around this topic. What are your thoughts around this being considered a black swan, a grey elephant, or or rhino, a great rhino? What is it that we can call this?
Yeah, I know that it's become a favorite expression, a black swan event, which is something that's totally unanticipated. But even the great shock of the financial crash, there were a few sort of mavericks who anticipated that subprime mortgages would fall in value, and therefore the collective investments surrounding subprime mortgages were no longer AAA, and so forth and so on. So very seldom do you get an event which is just totally beyond all human imagination. And the same applies to this pandemic. There were organizations talking about it, but because it's now obviously on everybody's mind. I mean, nobody talks about anything else. But in November last year, if I'd actually said to all of you, here's a scenario of a pandemic next year, and it's going to result in the complete lockdown of the global economy, you'd have said, huh? And so, it's the reception to an idea, because people do put these ideas of black swan events out there, but the response is, oh, what a waste of time. Let's get on with business as usual. And so that's why I say one of the critical things for a risk management committee is to look externally to the business at what risks could be posed out there to the business. It's not just looking for, who's cheated on their expense accounts, or on the accuracy of the accounts themselves. It's about assessing the external risks to the business, and particularly ones that can be considered unusual, and putting them to management.
Claude had a follow-up question, Clem, and I think you've answered that, but let me just make sure. Claude's question was, so what do you think risk managers to do to ensure that these COVID-19 type risks in the future are considered at a board and an exco level? How can we change, and what do we have to change to make us heard? You just reflected that they would have said go away, but given the lessons learned, what do we change?
Well, obviously, what I feel is that this is such a good place to start, because even the CEO stuck in the much ado about nothing groove must admit that opening up is going to involve social distancing, because it's going to be a law. It's a law, and they can say, I don't agree with it, but it is a law. So I would say this is a very good start to say, here's our best scenario of how long the tightrope's going to last, and what the experts are saying. And obviously, if there is a second wave, we will be advising you that it's beginning, and therefore this whole restrictive process could last longer. But meanwhile, this is what it means to our business in terms of risks that are unacceptable and risks that are acceptable, because we all know you cannot eliminate risk altogether unless you close your business. And therefore, you've got to have a debate around what the acceptability of risk is around this virus, and what social distancing measures are reasonable. But that's a very good start for a long-term process, where when you have the audit committee reporting to the board, that part of that report has the latest global and South African risks, how they're ranked, and what the impact on the business could be, and what they feel the business should do about it, or indeed leaving it up to the board to say what we'll do about it. But you should have that ranking of global and South African external game-changing flags, which you can call risks.
Okay, Clem, we've got time for 2 more questions. I've just received one from Daniel. I just want to quickly follow up. There are so many scenarios to consider, and as time moves on, many more factors need to be considered. How does an organization decide on the appropriate scenarios to follow?
Yeah, look, that's a very good question, Daniel, because you cannot have too many scenarios. I know this, and Pierre taught me this. Pierre said, what you do is you look for the predetermined elements, what I call the flags, which close the cone of uncertainty as you look into the future. Because you cannot offer scenarios covering 360 degrees. Only the Delphic Oracle did that, and that wasn't any use to anybody. So in order to select scenarios that are plausible and really matter, you go back to the trends that you select. So I gave you my flags. I gave you the grey flag. I gave you the red flag, the green flag, the national debt flag, the anti-establishment flag. So you set the scene with the flags, and then you come up with plausible scenarios inside the flag. So before the pandemic, we had 2 scenarios for the global economy, only 2, just like the high road, low road for South Africa. We didn't have 10, we had 2. We had gilded cage, where the whole process that Trump has set in motion with walls between Mexico and America and elsewhere, that became a dominant force, and therefore you're in a gilded cage, muted growth global economy, slow economic growth, much tougher conditions to do business, gilded cage. And then the other scenario we had was Friendly Planet, where, somebody either goes up against Trump or replaces Trump in the next election, who says, guys, we've got to get back to the kind of ethic that we had in the last century of open trade. And then you have a reasonable debate around, a couple of scenarios. So you're quite right. You must not have too many scenarios. And you can have game boards where you choose two uncertainties and make a game board or matrix of 4 possible scenarios. It's another thing. You choose an uncertainty which can go positive, negative, another uncertainty which can go positive, negative, and you have 4 possible scenarios. We have a business game board in the Fox trilogy where we've written all 3 books. We have a thing called the business game board, which is around that. And so, yeah, you must not produce too many scenarios.
Clem, thank you. Last question. Then I suppose we are on our time. The previous question was from Claude, by the way. Daniel was saying, you talked about the 21st century belonging to China. How is it when there is a conspiracy theory that China manufactured this virus? How is it then that there's this conspiracy theory? What would you respond to that?
Well, the conspiracy theory is obviously from people who don't want China to end up as number 1. And so it's rather like the conspiracy theory around 9/11, that it was caused by Americans. And my view is that the international media is now so powerful, and there are so many whistleblowers, that something like the idea that the Chinese government manufactured this virus in a lab in Wuhan and then sort of spread it around, and then managed to have a vaccine available so that it didn't really hit China, and only 5,000 people died in China, but lots more people died in Europe. Gee whiz, I would have thought that the international press would have been onto that. People in Hong Kong would have been onto that. So I don't buy the idea that China manufactured this virus or did anything. I do believe, and this is one of the points that I would have made to the Chinese Communist Party, that wet markets are a risk. They produce SARS, they produce MERS. So why on earth do you go on allowing wet markets in China where these animals are sold in cages, bats and other animals, when you have this risk of transmission from animals to human beings? You would have thought that the Chinese, being who they are, that when you had SARS and MERS, which were clear flags on the transmission of viruses from animals to humans, that they would have closed down any market that allowed this to happen. And as somebody has said to me since, there's still a huge amount of viruses around in ordinary farming of animals with pigs and chickens and everything else. So, there's got to be a debate around this, that how high is the risk of certain methods of farming to the human race, and that is what the Chinese should have done. That's what they should have done. But I'm afraid to say, I just don't believe the story that the Chinese manufactured the virus, but they overlooked the risk of the wet markets.
Excellent, thanks. Clem, as you can imagine, we've got so many more questions, but we've run out of time. So we want to really say thank you, Clem, for sharing this morning with us. Really appreciate your insights, and a lot for us to ponder and think about and change moving forward to make risk management more effective, especially when it comes to that conversation that the board and the EXCO don't want to have, the uncomfortable truth sort of stuff. Just to the members, for the people that dialed in, thank you very much. We have recorded our session, and we will be distributing this soonest after our webinar this morning. Clem, thank you very much to all the people that dialed in. Have a very safe day. Thank you.
Thank you, and may the fox be with you.
Thank you.